Hey y'all, welcome to the Team LocoFit Roundtable, hosted by me, Laurin and Karina, owner of Team LocoFit. Each week, I am joined by one of our coaches to dive headfirst into the nutrition, training, mindset, and coaching strategies we use with our clients. If you loved the show, please subscribe, leave us a review, tell a friend, you know the drill. And for more information about coaching, the programs we offer, and additional content, visit teamlocofit.com. All right, and we are back this week with Coach Karina.
Hey guys.
And today's podcast is going to be a little more technical than usual. We're still going to intertwine a lot of practicality and some takeaways for you guys. But we wanted to cover fat metabolism, mostly because Karina had just done, you just either written a paper or something in class, and you thought this was like super relevant.
I literally just spent an entire month writing about it, reading about it, learning about it, taking exams on it.
So we're like, hey, let's get a little nerdy, but also, as always, weave in the kind of practical side of things.
Yeah, no, this isn't going to be a biochemistry course, but
no.
Obviously there's concepts that we could easily and have applied to coaching, and I think that the goal as a coach and with this podcast is to educate the listeners and our clients, and the more clients and people understand and know, I always find that like the more willing they are to adhere to the plan if they understand like the process more.
For sure. It's the why behind everything. You know, it's like the intention and not just, hey, here's a recommendation that I pulled out of my ass. Like there's a reason why we say certain things or we suggest not to do certain things.
Yeah, and I know you do this as well because you've coached me, and what I do with all my clients is like, we're making these changes, this is why, and like this is how this is working, or this is how this is not working, and things like that. And so I really brought this topic up to Laurin because I feel like, especially for our niche and industry, like everyone is obsessed with losing fat. You know, when anyone goes into a diet or any sort of weight loss journey, like we don't want to lose muscle. Like the goal is to lose body fat, and so kind of like the obsession with body composition improvement is mostly focused on losing as much body fat as possible up into a healthy point and maintaining muscle mass. And so recently within the program, we really dove deep into understanding fat metabolism, you know, really kind of getting through the weeds of in terms of I think, like I told you, our first thing we're going to talk about is lipolysis versus fat oxidation, and how a lot of those terms get thrown around and like they're not the same thing. And a lot of products are sold to increase quote unquote fat burning when all they really do is increase lipolysis, which is important for fat oxidation, but it's not going to get us the end result we want, which is to shrink fat cells or shrink fat cells. As we discussed earlier.
Earlier, Karina said that, which, so for anybody who's not aware, like when you have an adipocyte, which is
a fat cell.
Yeah, it's the big fat cell, and there's lots of little ones inside of it. And what happens is it pretty much starts to empty out. It doesn't necessarily one adipocyte doesn't just like go away. It gets like the fat cells get emptied out, and then eventually they shrink. Right.
And I said they shrink, and she's like, no, they empty out. And I'm like,
we're like, wait,
same thing. Well, okay. We're both so tired.
I was at a like Q&A. Well, there was an event this weekend that I was not a part of, but John Gorman and Jason Theobald put it on as a 2-day seminar, and then they had a Q&A where we did a live recording, and it was like 2 hours, and then we like hung out for like an hour afterwards and like answered questions with more questions. And so it was like a 3-hour like focus fest for me at least, and which is always super great, and it was amazing. But you kind of don't realize how like mentally tired you get from those things. And we like got in the car, and then we like ate, and we both were like, okay, caffeine, and we need to get our shit together before we record these podcasts. So I was like,
caffeine, and
I was like, no, there's fat cells are not. That's where my brain was at before we recorded. So hopefully, with our notes, we stay on track.
We try to be as organized as possible with our content. But so I think one of my favorite facts that I learned about this semester is just kind of like the abundance of energy that we get from fat, right? And so a lot of people look at fat as, you know, not this great thing, like no one wants it, but you know, there is an importance to having some amount of body fat, and most adults have over 100,000 kcals worth of energy stored within their body, which is pretty amazing to think about. Like we were essentially built to always have this fuel tank with us, which is 50 times more than what carbohydrates can supply. And carbohydrates are an amazing fuel source, but they're meant to be a more short-term fuel source compared to fats. So I just, I thought that was like super interesting. Just the reason why people can fast for 24 plus hours is because of the nature of our fat cells. And so
you got plenty of fuel. Well, unless you're already like hella shredded, and say you're like competing or something like that, and you're already like an essential body fat. We would not recommend that. But outside of those extreme circumstances.
Okay, so like kind of an aside, but kind of not an aside. What I find super helpful in terms of mindset going into diets or fat loss phases is really not going in with a scarcity mindset and just understanding like, you'll be fine. Like some people will cut like 20 grams of carbs and they'll try to get away with, as much as possible in terms of like, trying to like essentially feeling like they have like no food now.
Yes. Or they try to feel like they were feeling when they weren't dieting.
Right.
And like chasing that feeling
still fine.
is harmful.
Yeah.
Like mentally, it just makes it a lot harder.
Yeah.
When you're always like, oh, well, I felt like this when I was eating more food. I should try and feel like that this way by drinking like 17 diet sodas and like 2 gallons of water and like chewing gum and having all like, whoa,
you're all right.
You're good.
You're okay. It's gonna be fine.
And when you do that, you actually, I think
it makes it worse.
It makes it way worse.
Yeah.
You become way more obsessed with hunger and how you're feeling on a day-to-day basis instead of being like, okay, I'm entering a deficit and I'm probably going to be hungry and that's the byproduct of this. And I find that just like mental switch doesn't make it easier because it's still challenging, but it's kind of like the stress perception stuff, right? Like you can look at it as like, this stressor is challenging or this stressor is debilitating. So it's the same way with hunger. Like, all right, hunger is a part of it. This is another challenge that I'm going to be facing. And then, obviously there's some points again where it's more extreme than others when it's at the end of a deficit or you've been dieting for 9 months. Like clearly there's, you're just like, wow, this really sucks. But in the beginning especially, and just in general, trying to have that mindset, like you said, don't have the scarcity mindset. And go into it as like, yep, hunger's part of it. It's going to be a challenge and I'm going to get through it.
But I'm like not going to die.
Yeah, no.
And so I also find that just with myself in general, and like I see it within my clients as well as like individuals who have a lesser of a scarcity mindset coming out of a diet feel less of a need to binge eat and overdo it, right? Because, their mindset was like, I was okay for most of the part. Obviously, there's those last few weeks in a very extreme context of competing on stage and things like that, where you're going to be underfed. But so I don't know. That was kind of an aside, but
that's
somewhat related.
Pretty much goes into fat metabolism.
Yeah, and coaching and like the coaching aspect of it. And so I don't want to throw like a science lesson at you guys. We want to like try to make this applicable and practical and things like that. So I think the first thing when it comes to fat metabolism is distinguishing the difference between lipolysis and fat oxidation. So fat oxidation is essentially the burning of fat for fuel. And that's what we want when it comes to actually, like we said earlier, shrinking our fat cells and losing body fat. Lipolysis is the breaking down of a triglyceride. So a molecule of fat is a triglyceride, which is made up of a backbone of a glycerol and 3 fatty acids. So lipolysis breaks that apart, and the burning of the 3 fatty acids is what essentially decreases the adipocyte cell size, loses body fat. So a lot of times
you could break that apart and then it could reconfigure.
Yes, so reesterification. So a lot of times thermogenic supplements and products and caffeine, those increase lipolysis, the breakdown of a triglyceride. But it's super important for us to actually burn that fat for those fatty acids to make their way into the mitochondria and actually be used for energy. But that does not always happen. And oftentimes that triglyceride, that fat molecule, will become what Laurin said, reesterified. It'll turn back into a triglyceride, which is obviously not really helping with burning fat in general. So the breakdown of fat and the actual burning of fat are 2 different things. And so sometimes I think that people will think that, oh, this increases lipolysis, or words will get thrown around like, you want to increase lipolysis. Yes, you want to increase lipolysis to burn body fat because lipolysis is a precursor to fat oxidation, but it's very easy to just, increase lipolysis without actually burning any body fat. And so how that ties into coaching is you can't rely on like thermogenic supplements, you can't rely on fat burner pills. While they can be helpful, you need to make sure that you're in a diet, you need to make sure that you're training hard, and whatever other XYZ factors that your coach is going to put you through to help you lose that body fat.
And that's where you could get into a little bit more of the nitty-gritty details as far as like timing stuff, right? So if you did want to time maybe caffeine or any kind of supplements that are going to increase lipolysis, you could do that around, let's say, like a low intensity steady state cardio, which we're going to get to, but that primarily burns fat. So that would be a good time to use that, right? And because it's all happening on a cellular level, you can't say, okay, I know exactly how many triglycerides broke apart, how many of them got used for fat oxidation, how many of them were esterified. Like, you don't know, but you can say, okay, to the best of our knowledge, this is what we could do. And I'm going to either take caffeine or a product that will help with lipolysis, and then I could do an activity that will help with burning fat.
Yeah.
So put those two together, and then, hey, we have a better chance of actually, losing body fat. Of course, being in a deficit and all those things too, but you could time those up.
Yeah, so, and then on the flip side, for people who are like, supplements don't work, supplements like fat burners can work if everything else is in line, and that's why they're called supplements, because they have to supplement, your entire nutrition and exercise regimen that needs to be the foundation.
The other thing too with a lot of fat burners, which is a totally different side, is most of the time, a lot of them not only have things to increase lipolysis, but the main thing, it's more of like an indirect help, because a lot of them will have appetite suppressants, which of course is going to help in a calorie deficit when you're hungry, and it's obviously typically going to have caffeine as well, which will help with energy and focus and appetite. So a lot of times it's like when you look at things that are labeled as fat burners, typically it's going to be a combination of ingredients that are going to help help you with that, versus being like, this is just shredding body fat off of you. It's kind of like, no, these are more indirect mechanisms, and they can say whatever they want. So they say fat burning, right? And in conjunction with a diet and exercise, they could, right? So it's just one of those things that oftentimes it's more of like an indirect thing, which is why you'll see things like, the appetite suppressants, or something for caffeine and energy and mood and all of that. And sometimes it'll have like other minerals too that might be depleted with fighting. So it just kind of depends. But random aside, but
Okay, so we talked about lipolysis being an important precursor to fat oxidation, which is the burning of fat. And so I think it's important to also go over what activates lipolysis and what inhibits lipolysis. So important activators of lipolysis are catecholamines, which are the hormones epinephrine and norepinephrine. Which is oftentimes why caffeine helps to burn or to activate lipolysis, because that elevates circulating epinephrine levels. And so going into lipolysis inhibitors, the main big one that I know of, Dr. Campbell would probably know more, but what we went over is insulin. And so I think that's important to touch on, like from a coaching perspective, because oftentimes, and we did a podcast where we talked about like the first adjustments we'll make when entering a diet is often we'll reduce carbs before touching fat or protein. Obviously protein is the very last one we want to touch. But that is because insulin it serves as a gatekeeper to fat loss. And if insulin levels are too high, it's going to be really difficult to essentially activate CAMP, which is going to be a super important enzyme to activate fat loss. So insulin is a main inhibitor of lipolysis, and so that's why individuals who will go on super low carb diets will burn fat pretty quickly.
But again, when people hear that, they go, oh, okay, so let me just cut all the carbs out.
No,
And that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to lose more body fat, because losing body fat is not just regulated by insulin. That is one piece of the component.
Right.
Obviously, the other components
Like
are,
you're always going to have insulin. Like,
yeah, you're always going to have, even if you're doing a ketogenic diet, you're still secreting insulin, because unless you are just eating dietary fat, protein is going to secrete insulin as well. Depending, obviously, how it's going to be to a lesser degree, but it will. It will do that as well. And then obviously carbs too. So, but that doesn't mean, oh my gosh, like I should never eat carbs. You know, there is a calorie deficit. We do have to take into consideration, again, which we're going to get to, types of training that you're doing, and all of these different factors. So yes, we need to keep insulin in check, and it's certainly one of the important things to look at. But it doesn't mean that you can't lose weight eating carbs, because almost all of our clients do that. Of course, if they're on a ketogenic diet, they're not eating a lot of carbs, but outside of those circumstances, almost everybody else is.
Yeah, and there are clients who lose weight on, like, some individuals respond really well to higher carb, like very, very low fat. Mm-hmm. But in that instant, just being in a caloric deficit in general is going to help with keeping insulin levels low. And so also what I'll see with individuals who have super high insulin circulating levels, as you might see in blood work sometimes, those are the individuals who obviously probably have like other things going on, but they'll have a pretty hard time losing body fat. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the initial adjustments might take a little bit longer, and we did that podcast on where we talked about, you know, why you're not losing weight at the start of a diet. If you guys haven't listened to that, we would highly recommend it. Because it touches on some really important points where a lot of people get frustrated in the beginning of a diet. But this is one of the reasons, you know, if you have lost some insulin sensitivity because you've been in a maintenance or a surplus phase for a while, which is pretty normal, you're going to run into this, and it's going to take a little bit of time to adjust that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so I think from here it'd be good to segue into what you touched on is different training modalities. So a lot of people will also advertise like workouts, and it's like, this is a fat burning workout or fat burning cardio. Like, you know, technically we're always, you know, burning fat all the time, right? But the two factors.
Right now, we are just fat burning machines.
Oh, so right now,
actually.
Yeah,
literally.
Right now, 70% of the lipolysis that is going on is being re-esterified. Yeah. So when it comes to specific exercise modalities, two important factors are exercise intensity and exercise bout. So at all times, we're going to be utilizing both carbs and fats for energy.
I think a lot of people don't know that.
Yeah, no, all the time.
You're always using a combination. The amount is just different depending on the type, but it's something that I think a lot of people think is either like, oh, this is just carbs, or oh, this is just fats. And it's like, no, it's always combination.
Yeah, unless you're on like a ketogenic diet, like for epilepsy, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
just met somebody today.
So for most people, and I've done probably close to 100 resting metabolic rates tests at this point, where we also look at ratio quotient, which tells us how, like, your ratio of carbs to fats that you're burning, and 90% of people are mixed. Mm-hmm. So very important to understand that most of the time we're using a combination. When it comes to exercise intensity, that will determine which fuel is going to be predominant. So for intensities that are up to 60 to 65% of your VO2 max, that's going to be you're going to be predominantly burning fat at that point. And then 65% and above, like say 70% to 100% of your VO2 max, you're at that point utilizing primarily the glycolytic carbs system and phosphagen system. And so that's oftentimes why you'll see a lot of bodybuilders at the gym walking at an incline, steady state cardio, as quote unquote the fat burning zone. Because fat is used predominantly as the fuel source at lower intensities. So the other factor is exercise bout, or duration, how long it is. And that kind of goes common sensely hand in hand with exercise intensity. So the longer you exercise, the more you're going to transition into predominantly burning fat, because you can only maintain 70+% of your VO2 max for so long. And shorter intensities, like a Wingate test or like a 100-meter sprint, is going to be primarily based on carbohydrates for fuel, which is why it's often recommended for athletes who are doing like high intensity sports, or like high intensity sprints and things like that, that they actually need carbs to perform, and it's super important.
If you're an athlete who's outside of very, very long duration, which I would still argue carbs would be a better source.
Pretty much the research shows that.
Yeah, pretty much any athlete is going to benefit more from a higher carbohydrate diet. Obviously, again, within a certain calorie balance that's right for the individual, that is clearly where it's like more nuanced. But it's really important to understand that, like, if you're trying to do, you know, sprints and all these HIIT workouts, and you're trying to do like sport specific stuff, and you're not eating carbs, you're really setting yourself up not only to not have good performance, but also to not really be able to recover.
Right.
So that's actually one of the reasons why I don't love clients who are dieting, especially bodybuilding clients, to do HIIT.
I just don't think it's needed for the like specificity of the goal.
Exactly.
Which is, but like, if it's based on aesthetics.
Yes.
If you're a performance athlete, it's different.
Totally different. When you're a bodybuilder, you can literally do any method works. You just have to do enough of it, of the right one. And that's why when you see people walking, part of it is because, one, they are not eating enough really throughout the day. Like, they're trying to fuel their training and focus their intensity and their energy on lifting weights. So when they're doing their cardio, there's really no sense in utilizing extra carbohydrates there when you could just be using primarily fat for fuel source.
Yeah.
Right, when you're doing that. And then really the practical application there is there's way better recovery with low intensity stuff. Obviously high intensity stuff is going to take a lot more recovery. And when you just don't have the calories, it's really hard. Now, are there certain clients that I do HIIT with? Yes. Are there certain instances where, you know, especially if somebody's really short on time, and we can add in like a few circuits or something? Yes, we totally do that. And a little bit more like metabolic conditioning type stuff.
Yeah.
But as far as like, hey, here's a Wingate, like do 10 of them all out, like that's going to be damn near impossible to do as a physique athlete who's a few weeks out. So, you know, doing a little bit of a metabolic conditioning, like that's a little bit different, like a circuit versus something like that. And I used to do both. I used to coach people to do HIIT the whole prep, and I even did it myself. And once I realized like how much better things were with lower and moderate intensity, like, it's really fucking boring. I get it.
And it takes a lot of time.
Yeah, and that is a drawback, you know. So if you're somebody who's a general population client, it's like, all right, we have a lot more options here, you know. But for bodybuilding specificity, we have to worry about injury prevention. We have to worry about recovery. We have to worry about maintaining muscle mass. There's a lot of things going on that point to, all right, using mostly low intensity cardio is going to be maybe more beneficial for fat burning, but more importantly, you're actually going to have the resources available. Like your body will have the resources available for that, because the only carbs that you're taking in are probably going to be put towards training.
Yeah, which is going to be important for muscle preservation, right? Like the goal specifically in bodybuilding is to maintain as much muscle mass as we can and lose as much body fat as we can. And resistance training is going to be very important for helping you maintain that muscle mass. And so you want to be able to perform there.
Cardio is actually the lowest tool on the rung that I like to use, to be really honest, especially for bodybuilders. I mean,
other people look better when you're not exhausting that tool too soon.
Some people will always have to do more cardio than others, right?
Yeah.
It's just kind of the reality of the way that their body operates. If they have a long history of doing a lot of cardio,
you don't have to recover from not eating.
Yeah, like that was honestly such a big takeaway that I learned from my last prep. Now, mind you, at the end, my cardio still got pretty high, but for the most part, you know, again, that's normal, but for the most part, it wasn't. And I have a lot of clients who are just like really short on time. So I'm like, I'm not even worried about this. Like, you know, we can do a little bit of cardio and we mostly focus on the calorie deficit and training. So you're gonna have to diet harder, but you're likely going to look better. And again, this is for a physique athlete. This is, you know, clearly if you're doing anything performance related, especially if it's cardiovascular, like you gotta do your cardio. But for a specific population like that, you really can do kind of whatever method. And that's the last method I like to use.
Yeah, so I think we did a really good job in terms of like talking about fat metabolism during exercise. And then my last point I wanted to touch on is the research on fat metabolism for resistance training, right? And to be honest, there isn't a lot. There's a handful of studies that looks at fat metabolism around resistance exercise, because a lot of it is focused around aerobic sports like cycling, marathon runners, and things like that. But generally, the studies in which that we reviewed, basically all that they went over and found was that fat oxidation is increased after resistance training anywhere from 40 minutes up to 2 hours post-exercise. And so you can do with that what you want. But I think that's a really good indicator of, I think we need to do more research in that area, because that's such a big window for a few studies to just say, oh, it was only elevated for 40 minutes. And then this other study showing that, oh, it was elevated for up to 2 hours. And maybe more knowledge on that, as coaches, we can do something with like nutrient timing, just having a better understanding on that. So that's kind of like the last thing I wanted to share. But in general, like I think that with being in the industry in which everyone wants to be lean, obviously generally we want to be healthy, but everyone is focused on having a healthy amount of body fat or reducing body fat. I felt like this is kind of a good thing to have a general understanding on. We didn't go too technical or too deep, but just really good to kind of go over and hopefully help people understand more about fat metabolism in general.
Yeah, and one more thing, just because I've seen this come up a bunch, and you touched on it a little bit, so the respiratory quotient. And when you do a resting metabolic rate test, you can see this. And typically, this is most influenced by what you're eating. If you're somebody who eats more fats, you're going to see more fats that you're burning. If you eat more carbs, you're going to see more carbs. And if you kind of have a pretty mixed diet, you're going to see a pretty mixed response. There's this, I don't know, I call it a device. I guess it's called Lumen, Lumen. Have you seen this? It basically, and I don't know how valid it could be, but basically the idea is that you use it to test. They're like, oh, are you burning more carbs or fats? Eat. They don't say that. I think it's a thing that you blow into.
Okay, that would make sense, because basically how we figure out your respiratory quotient is oxygen consumption versus carbohydrate.
Yeah, but that's
production.
20-minute test. Anyway, so I don't know how accurate it is, but they're marketing it as if you're burning more carbs or you're burning more fats. It's no, that just has to do with what you're eating. So I think it's again one of those gimmicky things that has some science behind it, so it sounds technical and cool. But when you see that, I just want everybody to understand based on what you're eating, you're going to show that more. It doesn't mean that because you're in a fat loss deficit, you're going to blow more more fat because you're burning more body fat. If you're eating more carbs, you're going to have more carbs. You know what I'm saying? So it's one of those things that has a little bit of science there, but I wouldn't change your dietary behaviors based on that, because it literally is just a reflection of what you're already eating.
Yeah.
So you can't base your changes off of that.
Right. Yeah.
The only way to show more fat is to eat more fat, and that might work for you and your diet and your body.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that you're burning more body fat.
Yeah. Individuals who have been dieting for a while, individuals who have been dieting for a while will typically show up closer to 7. So the scale is if your respiratory quotient is closer to 0.7, that would be quote unquote 100% burning fats or energy. And up to 1.0, that would be 100% carbs. And then most people fall around 0.8, which is that kind of perfect mix. But most people who are dieting, because we have a lot of competitors come to the lab and kind of want to see where their RMR is at the end of a diet or at the start of a diet. But at the end of the diet, it's never just 7, but it's on the lower end. Simply because they're not eating very many carbs, and fat oxidation is possibly a lot higher because insulin is lower because they're eating less carbs. But like you said, it's reflective on diet.
It's reflective of what you're already doing, so I wouldn't use that. You can use that as a tool, as an interesting I really don't know how valid it would be. Might be interesting to buy one and then compare it with the lab one. right? Like you could like do the lab test and then do it like literally right after.
Hey Lumen, if you want us to do a study, fund the lab and we'll publish.
After we just talked trash about it, totally fun this.
If you want to prove yourself.
I don't think that it's a bad, I think that it basically would show you that information, but I don't think that it can be extrapolated that way, like how it's being marketed.
Oh, I mean, what we use in the lab is like $6,000. Like it's very fancy, or probably more, I don't know, but it's like top of the line, like took Dr. Campbell a long time to have enough money to buy it. Yeah, so if you guys want to get your arm tested,
let Karina know.
Yeah, let me know.
No, but really. So I think this was a really great episode. Went over some really practical stuff as well as understanding a little bit more of the why behind fat metabolism in general. So as always, thank you guys for listening. If you have any other questions for us, you can go to teamlocofit.com. On there, we have all the other podcasts, articles that we've written. You can also apply for coaching and send us an email through that link as well. And if you have any questions that you would like us to answer on the anonymous questions segment, still rolling with that name because we don't have a creative one. That link will be in the show notes. Keep that as detailed as possible. That way we can actually really help, because we want it to be very situational specific to you, or a situation that maybe you know somebody else is going through that maybe they wouldn't feel comfortable asking. So thank you guys for tuning in, and we will talk to you on Wednesday.
Bye.